The 2-5-1 is one of the most important and also one of the most common chord progressions that we have in jazz. And that means that you play them all the time, but maybe sometimes you also want to add a little bit of variation to what is going on. Maybe you sometimes even want to sound a little bit less like a 2-5-1. That's what I'm going to go over in this video. I'm going to give you 8 different ways that you can sound different on a 2-5-1. Some of them are a little bit far out, and I'm going to focus on the 2 chord and on the 1 chord because I already have quite a lot of videos on how to change the sound of the 5 chord. But that also means that there's a lot of material here that you can use on other chord progressions and also especially on static chords like a static minor or a static major 7 chord. My name is Jens Larsen, learn jazz, make music. As you can tell from this example, I'm first playing through the chords. So you have an idea about what does this reharmonization sound like if I just play the chords. And then I'm playing a line, because I think it's very useful to just have a good idea about what does the chords sound like. That's going to make it a lot easier when you're trying to improvise lines and use this material to make meaningful melodies with a reharmonization. So that's also something you should do if you're working on reharmonizing standards or want to add a new sort of harmonic trick to your soloing skills and your vocabulary. In this example, I'm turning the 2 chord into a minor major chord, so really this kind of sound. And here I'm sort of taking sort of the core notes that are supposed to be in a 2 chord would be that it's a suspension of the 5 chord. So really, in this case with the A minor D7, it should be sort of a D sus almost. But I'm changing the G to a G sharp, and that's really changing the sound quite drastically. And that's also what I'm doing in the line, where we first get this augmented triad, and then I'm continuing with this B sus4 triad, and that's kind of spelling out like an A minor major with a 6 or with a 13. And that's a different sound from, of course, your basic A minor 7 with a 9. In this example, I'm actually using a very common reharmonization because I'm taking a major subdominant, so the 2 chord, the A minor 7, and then I'm replacing it with a minor subdominant, so that would be an A half diminished. And in this case, I'm playing an A half diminished with a 9th, like this. And the way I'm getting that out on the line is mostly, I'm starting with this trill, so, and then this quartal arpeggio from E flat, so really getting the E flat in there, the A and the D, to get that sound of the minor subdominant, which is of course the E flat and G major. To make the sound of the reharmonizations a little bit clearer, I went with some examples that are in a slower tempo, and that means that this tempo really lends itself well to using a lot of 8th note triplets especially. So I'm doing that quite a lot in these examples, and I'm also using some of the sort of polyrhythmic and the groupings that you can use with 8th note triplets. And in this example on the G major, I'm kind of using quarter note triplets in groups of 2, and that is almost feeling like I'm moving to another meter. So it starts to feel a little bit like I'm going to the quarter note triplet as a new tempo. The Prhygian chord is a great sort of powerful and dramatic sound that you can add to a reharmonization, and especially when you're expecting like an A minor 9 and then you get this A7 sus4 flat 9 sound, which is essentially, this is like an E half diminished with an A in the bass, or you can also look at it as being sort of the magic chord idea, so you have a B flat major 7 flat 5 voicing with an A in the bass. And that's also how I'm playing it here, so I'm using again some chordal harmony. So first this chordal arpeggio and then going on to this one to really spell out this sound, and then moving on into an altered dominant to just change the sound one more time before I resolve. I should probably also address the elephant in the room with this video, because we're changing the chords and I'm really coming up with some pretty far out reharmonizations along the way. And should the comping follow what the soloist is doing, how do you work with this? Of course, in an ideal world, then whoever's playing behind you can just follow whatever you're doing, even if you're just improvising with the harmony. But I think in reality, that's not always gonna happen. And hopefully they're sort of sensible enough to make sure that they're not really clashing very heavily with you and still listening to what you're doing. And then you also have to think about the fact that this is a progression that is moving. So we're kind of playing an A minor 7 to move to the D7, to move to the G major. And if you create a lot of dissonance, normally you would have the dissonance very much on the dominant. You would maybe play an alto dominant to have even more dissonance that you can resolve. But if you have the dissonance on the 2 chord, it will still just work as something that's pulling even more forward and something that will eventually resolve. That's also why with the second half of this video, when I'm talking about really using some other sounds on the major 7 chord, then maybe they're even more effective, because here we really expect a resolution, but we get sometimes a completely different sound, and that makes those reharmonizations a lot more effectful. And of course, now that we're turning the 2 chord into a dominant with a suspension like the Phrygian chord here, we can also just turn it into an alto dominant. That's what I'm doing here. So we kind of have an A7 altered. You can look at it as being also an E flat 7. So there are of course different ways. When you play it, it's gonna sound pretty much the same. So that doesn't really matter too much. And in this case, I'm using really the B flat minor sound on top to really get that A7 altered sound across. The dominant line in this example is a great example of using groupings of 8th note triplets. And here I'm really using groups of 4 8th note triplets together. So the first grouping is 3 notes and then a rest, and that's the second one as well. And then the last one, I'm really just playing 4 notes. But the repeating pattern that I'm using here also helps really sort of almost give the impression that we're going to another meter or in another tempo on top of the original groove. And that's of course this, and then repeating that with just changing the first note and then resolving. Now that I've covered 4 versions of the 2 chord, we can move on to making some alterations and some reharmonizations on the 1 chord. Making the tonic chord Lydian in a 2-5-1 is of course not something that's really far out, but at the same time, if you really go for that sharp 11 or flat 5 sound, then you can actually make it quite distinct and also quite effectful. And that's maybe the best way to use a reharmonization like that. And that's what I'm doing here. So here I'm really going for that sound by using a G major 7 flat 5 arpeggio, because then we don't have any D in there. So it's not just an extra passing note that we can run across. It's really the C sharp that I'm going for. And the way I'm doing that is that I'm playing a pattern on this arpeggio. So as we move through these examples, then it's going to sound less and less like we're actually resolving, and the sound of the G major that we expect at the end of the 2-5 is going to be pretty much gone at the end of this video. But in this case, I'm going for something that's still sort of common, because I'm resolving to a G major 7 sharp 5. This is a sound that I use myself really a lot. It's a very distinct sound, but it's also actually quite beautiful. It's a melodic minor sound, and the way I'm doing it here is that I'm also kind of sneaking it in there. So I'm first resolving to the G major 7 and then playing an arpeggio that's coming out of a shell voicing, so G major shell voicing, and there's no sharp 5 inside. Then I'm moving down and then really emphasizing that D sharp so that we can hear the sharp 5, and then adding the B and the A on top, so we have this sort of strange tritone on top of the G major 7 chord. using a lot of 8-note triplet rhythms in a tempo like this is something that I do a lot myself, and is also something that some of my favorite improvisers do as well. You will hear this with Rosenwinkel, you'll hear this with Herbie Hancock and Mehldau as well. It is definitely something to explore, especially in a tempo like this where you can quite easily play 8-note triplets. And it's just nice to also have something else to play instead of all the 8th notes all the time, certainly in a tempo like this. A really great, somewhat far out sound on a major 7 that you'll find with people like Wayne Shorter and Thelonious Monk once in a while is the major 7, sharp 9, sharp 11. And that's what I'm using in this example. So really that's treating the G major 7 as if it's the flat 6 in B harmonic minor. And that's of course quite a different sound from G major, the way we kind of expect it in the context of a 2/5. The way I'm using it in this example is that I'm playing a triad pair because we have 2 major triads that are half step apart that we can use, and that's the G major triad and then the F sharp major triad. And I'm just playing first the first inversion G major triad and then a root position F sharp major triad. So really getting the sharp 9 and the sharp 11 out there. The sound I'm using on the major 7 in this example is one of those sounds that recently I realized I'm using some scale sounds quite a lot that are actually scales that I never practiced. And this is one of them. This is the augmented scale. I worked a lot with it. I play it quite a lot, but I almost never practiced the scale. I may have played it, but I never really practiced it. Here I'm using on the G major, the augmented scale that has a G major triad in it. And that's the one that has 3 major triads. So it has G major, B major, and E flat major, and those are also the 3 triads that I'm using to get the sound of the scale across. And also when I'm improvising, that is kind of how I'm building the line. So I'm coming out and resolving immediately to the B major triad, so this sound, so that's really giving me G major 7 sharp 5. Then I'm going to the G major and I'm playing that a little bit differently, like this, still a triad, just a different melody. And that's not really giving me anything new in terms of the material that I'm using. And then I'm using 2 notes from the E flat major triad. I'm using first the E flat, which is of course still just the sharp 5. And then I'm using the B flat, which is the sharp 9. So all in all, I'm really spelling out sort of a G major 7 with a sharp 5 and a sharp 9. And essentially that chord sound is a B major triad, a B major 7 chord with a G in the bass. If you like using this technique to get other kind of sounds out of progressions that you already know, then maybe this video is something that you also want to check out, because here I'm taking a 12-bar blues and then I'm going over a few different types of pentatonic scales and also just some different choices and some different sounds that you can get just using pentatonic scales on a 12-bar blues.